The smoke rises in thin ribbons through the gaps in the thatch. It curls and twists, catching the last orange light of the fire pit before disappearing into the darkness above. Below, 43 human beings lie pressed together on packed earth, covered with dried grasses and animal hides. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of rendered fat, of ash and fermented grain. Somewhere near the entrance, a dog stirs and whines. Beyond the low walls of mud and timber, the wind carries the sound of goats bleating in a makeshift pen just 12 feet from where children sleep. This is not a scene of poverty. This is not a failure of civilization. This is home. This is safety. This is a Neolithic settlement in the Fertile Crescent, roughly 9,000 years ago, where humanity has just begun the experiment of staying in one place. And inside this crowded structure, invisible to every person present, death waits in the moisture of a cough. It breeds in the pile of human waste accumulated behind the grain storage. It multiplies in the intestines of the animals whose warmth these people depend upon for survival through the cold months. Disease has no eyes, no intention, no malice, but it is here. It is always here. By every measure of modern sanitation, this settlement should not survive the season. The density of human bodies creates perfect conditions for respiratory transmission. The proximity to livestock establishes pathways for zoonotic spillover. The lack of clean water, the absence of sewage systems, the shared vessels and sleeping spaces all represent what epidemiologists would classify as catastrophic risk factors. These people possess no knowledge of bacteria. They cannot see viruses. They have no concept of contagion as an invisible biological process. And yet, they persist. Not merely for a generation, but for thousands of years. Settlements expand, populations grow, communities survive outbreaks that should, by all mathematical models, eliminate them entirely. This is the paradox that haunts every attempt to understand ancient human health. The conditions appear fatal. The outcomes suggest otherwise. Something protected these people, something they could not name and did not understand. The answer does not lie in immunity alone. Natural selection operates too slowly to explain the survival of communities facing novel pathogens in concentrated population for the first time in human evolutionary history. The answer does not lie in luck. Probability does not favor thousands of independent settlements across continents and millennia all experiencing the same fortunate outcome. The answer lies somewhere else entirely. It lies in behavior. Consider the fire. In every ancient human dwelling, from the caves of the Upper Paleolithic to the mud brick houses of early Mesopotamia, fire occupies the center of human life. Anthropologists have long understood fire as a source of warmth, a tool for cooking, a social gathering point. But fire performs another function that ancient humans could not have articulated and would not have believed if told. Smoke contains phenolic compounds released during the incomplete combustion of organic material. These compounds possess antimicrobial properties. They suppress the growth of bacteria, fungi, and certain parasites. A structure filled with wood smoke is not merely a space where humans tolerate poor air quality for the sake of warmth. It is an environment where microbial life struggles to flourish. The very irritant that damaged ancient lungs and shortened ancient lives simultaneously reduced the pathogen load in shared living spaces. Archaeological analysis of preserved thatch and timber from Neolithic sites reveals patterns of carbon deposition consistent with near-continuous fire maintenance. Settlements were not occasionally smoky. They were perpetually saturated with combustion byproducts. The inhabitants lived inside a low-grade fumigation chamber of their own creation. They did not know why this helped them. They knew only that the fire must never go out. Waste tells a parallel story. Excavations of ancient settlements reveal consistent patterns of spatial organization that separate human waste from living and eating areas. At Çatalhöyük, one of the oldest known permanent settlements, refuse pits were located at the periphery of residential clusters. Human feces were deposited in designated areas away from water sources and food preparation zones. These were not sophisticated sewage systems. They were behavioral conventions passed from generation to generation without explicit explanation. The separation was never complete. Contamination remained constant, but the reduction in direct exposure created margins of survival. A child who does not play where adults defecate ingests fewer parasites. A water source located upstream from waste deposits carries lower bacterial loads. These margins compound over time. A 10% reduction in fecal-oral transmission across a community of 400 individuals translates into dozens of prevented infections per season. Dozens of prevented infections mean fewer deaths. Fewer deaths mean more adults capable of food production, childcare, and territorial defense. The system worked not because it eliminated risk, but because it reduced risk below the threshold of community collapse. Movement served a similar function. Before permanent settlement, humans were nomadic by necessity. They followed animal migrations, seasonal plant availability, and climate patterns. But this movement also provided an accidental epidemiological benefit that sedentary populations would struggle to replicate. When a campsite became contaminated with accumulated waste, parasites, or disease, the group moved. They left the contamination behind. The land had time to recover. Pathogens without hosts died. Parasite eggs desiccated. The cycle reset. Early agricultural communities could not abandon their fields. Their survival depended on staying in one place through planting, growth, and harvest. But they adapted the principle of movement to their new circumstances. Seasonal relocation of animal herds prevented the buildup of zoonotic pathogens in permanent structures. Ritual abandonment of dwellings after deaths or unexplained illness removed populations from environments that had become dangerous. Some communities practiced cyclical burning of old structures and construction of new ones on adjacent sites, destroying accumulations of vermin, parasites, and contaminated materials. These practices appear in the archaeological record as puzzling discontinuities. Villages abandoned without evidence of attack. Structures burned deliberately with valuable goods still inside. Mass relocations occurring within regions of apparent resource abundance. For decades, researchers attributed these patterns to religious practices, social upheaval, or environmental stress. More recent analysis suggests a simpler explanation. These communities were practicing disease avoidance through environmental reset. They were leaving places that had become dangerous to inhabit. They could not see the danger, but they had learned to recognize its signs. Diet constitutes another invisible defense. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture introduced new risks, but also new protective practices. Fermentation emerged independently in nearly every early agricultural society. Grains were converted to beer, milk became yogurt and cheese, vegetables were preserved in brine, fruits fermented into alcohol. These processes were developed for storage and preservation, not health, but they carried profound biological consequences. Fermented foods contain living microorganisms. These organisms colonize the human gut, establishing communities that compete with pathogenic bacteria for resources and space. A digestive system populated by beneficial microbes is more resistant to colonization by harmful ones. Ancient humans who regularly consumed fermented foods maintained gut microbiomes that provided a measure of protection against waterborne and foodborne disease. The evidence appears in coprolite analysis. Preserved ancient feces from sites with established fermentation practices showed different microbial signatures than those from sites without. The gut ecosystems of these populations were shaped by diet into defensive barriers. They had engineered their own internal environments through food culture, not medical intervention. Ritual and taboo served epidemiological functions that their practitioners would have attributed entirely to spiritual necessity. Menstrual seclusion, practiced in various forms across countless ancient cultures, removed individuals from communal food preparation during periods of potential vulnerability. Prohibitions against consuming animals that died of unknown causes eliminated a primary vector for disease transmission. Requirements for washing before religious ceremonies reduced pathogen loads on hands and bodies. Restrictions on contact with corpses limited exposure to the diseases that often cause death. These practices were encoded in religious law, enforced through social pressure, and transmitted through oral tradition. They were not understood as health measures. They were understood as obligations to gods, ancestors, or cosmic order, but their effects were biological, regardless of their perceived causes. Communities that developed and maintained these taboos experienced lower disease mortality than those that did not. Over generations, the taboos became more elaborate, more strictly enforced, and more effective. Natural selection operated not on individuals, but on cultural practices themselves. Groups whose behaviors reduced disease transmission survived and expanded. Groups whose behaviors did not were diminished or eliminated. The traditions that remained were the traditions that worked. The intimacy with animals presented the greatest challenge. Livestock provided milk, meat, leather, wool, and labor. They were essential to the agricultural economies that supported growing population. But they also harbored pathogens capable of crossing species barriers. Tuberculosis, influenza, smallpox predecessors, and countless other diseases made the leap from animal to human in these early agricultural communities. The proximity that enabled survival also enabled devastation. Ancient humans managed this risk through spatial strategies they could not have explained in epidemiological terms. Animals were kept close enough for protection and use, but separated by walls, barriers, or distinct structures. Sick animals were isolated or killed. Certain animals were excluded from human dwellings entirely, while others were permitted based on observed patterns of human illness following exposure. These selections were not random. They represented accumulated knowledge about which associations proved dangerous, knowledge paid for in deaths that created warnings for survivors. The evidence of cost surrounds these achievements. Skeletal analysis of ancient agricultural populations reveals the price paid for proximity to animals and each other. Tuberculosis left distinctive lesions on spines recovered from Neolithic burial sites. Parasitic infections created anemia visible in bone density measurements. Respiratory damage from chronic smoke inhalation appears in lung-adjacent skeletal structures. Dental pathology indicates nutritional stress from agricultural diets high in carbohydrates and low in diverse nutrients. These people were not healthy by modern standards. Their average lifespan was shortened by conditions they could not treat and exposures they could not eliminate. Children died in numbers that would constitute national emergencies in contemporary societies. Adults lived with chronic pain, recurring infections, and progressive deterioration that began in their 20s and accelerated thereafter. Survival did not mean comfort. It meant persistence. It meant maintaining population numbers above the threshold required for community viability. It meant continuing to exist when the mathematics of disease transmission suggested extinction. The systems that enabled this survival were not designed. They emerged. They evolved through trial and catastrophic error. They were refined by the selective pressure of mortality itself. A practice that reduced deaths was repeated. A practice that increased deaths was abandoned, along with the people who maintained it. What remained after thousands of years of this process was a set of interlocking behaviors that no single individual understood, but that every surviving community embodied. Fire suppressed pathogens in the air. Waste separation reduced fecal-oral transmission. Movement and abandonment allowed environmental recovery. Fermentation fortified gut immunity. Taboos prevented high-risk behaviors. Animal management limited zoonotic spillover. Each element addressed one aspect of the disease environment. Together, they created conditions in which human populations could grow despite facing constant microbial assault. These ancient humans stood no chance against epidemic disease once it arrived in force. When populations grew dense enough, when trade routes connected distant communities, when novel pathogens found susceptible population, death swept through settlements in waves that no behavioral system could prevent. The historical record of later periods confirms this. Plagues devastated civilizations that had survived for millennia. But before those catastrophic encounters, for the long millennia of early agriculture and settlement, behavioral systems held the line. They bought time. They enabled the accumulation of population, knowledge, and cultural complexity that would eventually produce the medical understanding capable of confronting disease directly. The people who developed these systems never knew what they had accomplished. They performed their rituals and maintained their separations and tended their fires for reasons they explained through myth and tradition. They lived and died believing they were pleasing spirits, or honoring ancestors, or maintaining cosmic order. They were doing something far more remarkable. They were engineering survival in a world saturated with invisible killers. They were building defenses against enemies they could not perceive, using only the tools of observation, memory, and cultural transmission. The fire still burns at the center of the dwelling. Smoke still rises through the thatch. 43 human beings still sleep pressed together in darkness, surrounded by waste and animals and pathogens beyond counting. But they will wake in the morning, most of them, enough of them, because ancient humans did not defeat disease by understanding it. They did not survive by curing what afflicted them. They survived by building lives that reduced their chances of affliction in the first place. Their medicine was not a substance. It was a way of living, and it kept humanity alive long enough to learn the rest.